Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf kafet. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island. This is schut for refuah shlema bekarov for Yakira Liba Bat Sarah Gita, beloved granddaughter of our friend Sipi Wokenfeld. May our learning be a schut for her and all Cholei Israel. Okay, we will get started now with the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. I'll make a quick announcement, which is, as in last summer, I will be away a lot of the summer, most of July and August. There'll be a few days in the middle of July I'll be around. We'll be doing Zoom probably, but otherwise, kind of from the beginning of July till close to the end of August, there won't be regular Zoom shiurim. I've actually been recording them in advance. So dedications over the summer, unless you get them in early enough, which might be too late for some already because I've been recording, but they'll be in print only and not necessarily announced. If you have, and you know in advance, from the middle of July, you can start sending them in. And then there won't be live Zoom, but there will be regular classes. Everything will be up early in the morning of every day. As usual, classes will go on, just not on a live Zoom. Okay, we'll get started today now at the bottom of our daf. We're going to get off on a bit of a tangent starting from an issue of get, and then we'll get off on a bunch of other related topics. The main thing we're going to be dealing with for the first part of today's daf is plants. Okay, how we get to plants, you will see. So let's do a quick review of our Mishna, because our Mishna is a very, very basic Mishna, because it goes to the root of, again, Ede Masira Karte, Ede Chatima Karte, which is something that will come up throughout the Masechet. So we have our Mishna, and also sometimes I find when you learn something at the end of the daf, it's not as clear because already the focus is less strong and we're getting toward the end. So I'll review this because it's very, very basic. The Mishnah had said, Ein kotbin b'mechubar lakarka, very simply. You cannot write on anything that's attached to the ground. And then a second later, it said, but if you did, as long as you uprooted it before it was signed, you give it to her, it's fine. Okay, which seems to simply follow Rabbi Meir, who says, Ede chatima karte. So basically what it's saying is, don't write it, and this was one way we understood the Mishnah, the last way we understood it in the Gemara, which was, don't write it attached to the ground, because, now remember, what's the whole issue? It says v'chatav v'natan. You have to write it and give it, which means there can't be anything separating, any sort of important action separating between the writing and the giving. Now, writing, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar understand differently. Rabbi Meir understands writing is the writing and the signing. In other words, really the signing is what's important. Rabbi Elazar understands it's the writing that's important. So therefore, the way Rabbi Meir reads this Mishnah is very simple. The writing is not as important. It's the signing. So as long as the signing was done when it's detached, since the Torah said v'chatav v'natan, it has to be immediate, and katav he understands as v'chatam, the signing of the written document. So as long as it was signed, so you shouldn't write it, because if you write it, you might accidentally sign it. That's the first line. The next line is, but if you did already, it's only a gzera not to write in case you sign it when it's attached. But if you detached it, signed it while it was detached, and gave it to her, that's all fine. But they also explained the Mishnah, right? There were many people who explained it this way, both Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshaya, who said, we're going to explain this Mishnah according to Rabbi Elazar, and that's probably because in general we hold like Rabbi Elazar, and therefore they prefer to try to explain the Mishnah according to Rabbi Elazar, which is Ede Masira Karte. The signatures are not the witnesses that are making the get. It's the witnesses who witness the get being given to her, which means that they can understand the word v'chatav in its simple reading, that the writing is what's important. They don't need to say katav is v'chatam, or he doesn't, Rabbi Elazar, and those who follow him. So therefore, what's the Mishnah talking about? If the writing has to be done properly, and v'chatav literally means v'chatav, how could you possibly not have a break? How could you possibly, potentially have a break and say it's still okay, right? The first line obviously makes sense, don't write it. But the next line, which says if you wrote it, as long as you signed it, is okay. That doesn't really seem to match Rabbi Elazar. So they understand signature here, not exactly a signature. They understand as long as you filled in the blank words with your name, her name, all those details, where they live, what the date is, if those details were filled out when it was detached, that's fine. And what the Mishnah is saying is, don't write the tofes, the form letter, right, the form part. But if you did, it's okay, as long as you fill in the important stuff once it's detached. So those were the two basic ways of understanding our Mishnah. Now we're going to talk about, what if you have a plant with a hole in it? Now, a plant with a hole in it is one of the favorite sugya of the rabbis. because it's detached from the ground, but it's also attached to the ground. So now you have this case of something. Why is it attached? Because it has a hole. Because it has a hole, it theoretically gets nutrients from the ground, and therefore it's like it's attached to the ground. On the other hand, and this you don't usually, when you get to these cases, we don't usually talk about this because we're usually talking about what grows from the plant. Right now, we're not as concerned about that. Right now, we're going to talk about the pot itself, okay, which is clearly not attached to the ground because you pick it up, right, easily. Let's say you wrote a get on that and gave it to the woman. Well, it's not missing any action whatsoever. And what's growing in the plant, which is also not really attached to the ground. However, it's somewhat treated like it's attached to the ground because it has a hole in it. So whereas in terms of all sorts of halachot, which are based on nutrients, it gets its nutrients from the ground and therefore is considered attached to the ground. On the other hand, in terms of get, well, it's not missing any action because you can pick up the plant and give her the plant. So if you wrote the get on the leaves, theoretically, it shouldn't be a problem either. So even though halachically for certain issues, this is considered attached to the ground and is considered land, which we're going to get to soon, all sorts of other ramifications of this plant. But in the beginning, we're going to talk about get, and it seems like it's not really attached to the ground for the purposes of get because you could just pick it up and give it to her. So right now we're going to start with that. Bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. Tavo al cheres shalatzitz nakuv kasher. If you wrote it on a cheres, the earthenware vessel of this plant, the pot basically, and the atzitz nakuv means it has a hole at the bottom, kasher, it's totally fine because you just give it to her, right? What do? Deshakele, you pick it up, yahiv le'niele, give it to her. Al alesh shalatzitz nakuv, if you write it on a leaf of this kind of plant, abai amal kashil berava amar pasul. Now, before we said, why should a leaf be a problem? So what? You still pick up the plant and give it to her. Well, abai amal kashil deshakelet yahiv le'niele. Abai says very simply, like we said before. So what if you wrote it on a leaf? It's not really attached to the ground. So pick it up and give it to her. No problem. Even though, again, for halachic reasons in other areas, maybe we'll consider it attached to the ground. Like, for example, is it hayav in trumot, masrot, all the tithes? Well, it's considered attached to the ground. If it's in Israel, right, we're going to say this is attached to the ground because it gets its nutrients from the ground. But forget, what's the difference? Doesn't make all you need to do is make sure you don't have to cut it. You don't have to cut this, so give it to her. But Rava, who we usually hold like when he argues with Abaye, other than 6 cases, and this is not one of them, Rava Amar Pasul Gzera Shema Yiktom. He says this is disqualified. Why? Because we're worried that you might cut it. And if you cut it before you give it to her, then that's going to be where you are missing an action between the writing and the cutting. And the giving. And therefore, we're going to say, don't give her a get. Don't write it on this leaf or this plant that is again, not attached to the ground, but in this perforated pot, because what will happen? You might accidentally cut it because you might think, well, I'm not going to give her the whole plant. I just want to give her this. And once you do that, you actually disqualify the get because then it's got some action in between the writing and the giving. So therefore, Rava says no good. Now we're getting off on a total tangent, as I said, and talk about all sorts of other things about perforated pots. Now, all these cases, they're going to say atzitz, but they're clearly talking about an atzitz nakuv, okay? One with a hole in the bottom or some sort of holes at the bottom, okay? Even though it doesn't say so. So now, for our intents and purposes, we're just going to call it a plant at this point. Atzitz shalachad uzraim shalacher. Okay, now we're going to get into the laws. The first issue is the laws of kinyanim, acquiring things. Now, there's different laws for acquiring things that are attached to the ground, which are really land, and movables. Movables, how do you acquire it? By mishicha, by pulling. I sell you something, you pull it, right? If I give you money, that's not a kinyan. If I give it to you and you actually pull it or lift it, then yes. Now, if it's land, then land is acquired in 3 ways, okay? You're asking if we learned about this in Masechet Shabbat. Probably. We learn about this all the time. It's a case that comes up very, very often. I don't remember in which Masechta we've learned it and which we haven't, but we definitely we've talked about this before, and we will talk about it a lot more going forward. It always comes up. So now we have this case where land. How do we acquire land? We acquire land in three ways. Kesef, money. Money actually works to acquire. It doesn't work to acquire movables, but it does work to acquire land. So if I bought your house and I gave you the money for it, that's a kinyan. If I gave you a shtar, okay, or you gave me a shtar, right? Basically, you said, I'm selling you the land, and you give me a shtar, we've done a kinyan. The third way is chazaka. Chazaka means the chazaka can mean different things when it comes to land. In this case, it means if I do something to the land, like I weed it, or I hoe it, rake it, I do some sort of action to improve the land, I've shown ownership over it. Okay, so if you sell me the land, and then I start working the land, that's mine. Okay, that's what does ownership. So let's say we sell it, and I didn't give you all the money yet, and we didn't write a document yet, but we agreed on a sale, and I go there and I start working the land, it's mine. So now we have a question. What if this plant has two owners? Meaning, atzitz shel echad, the pot is mine, and the zra'im shel acher, but the seeds and what's growing in the actual plant itself is yours. So what happens? First thing is, machar ba'al atzitz, the ba'al zra'im, this is just review of what I just said. If you sell me, I sell you, machar ba'al atzitz, the ba'al zra'im, right? The atzitz, it's tricky because atzitz really means plant, but what they mean here is the pot. If the owner of the pot, which is me, I sell you to you on the plant, kevan shemashach kana, all you have to do is pull it toward you, right? And it's yours because I'm selling you the movable part of this. But machar ba'al zra'im leba'al atzitz, if you sell me the seeds or the thing that's growing there, since it's a perforated pot, it's considered attached to the ground, which means that lo kana ad she'achzik b'zra'im. I actually have to do, okay, it could be even a shtar or a ketef, but they say if I start weeding it, then it will work. But basically, meshicha doesn't work. Okay, that is not good because that doesn't work for land. Now, it's funny, it doesn't work for land. Why? Because you can't pull land. In this case, you actually could do meshicha, but already since this has the definition of land on it, you're not going to be koneh until you actually start weeding it or improving the plant, fixing it up. Now, second case within this. Atzit uzra'im shalachad. You own both. Okay, you own the pot, you own the plant. Umecharan la'acher. And now you sell it to someone. Well, now you're selling something that has both. You have both something attached to the ground, and you also have something that's movable. And each one has its own criteria. So do you have to do both? So what do they say? If you start working the plant and fixing it up, you already acquire the pot. Why is that? Zoe Shashaninu. This is what we learn in a different source, and this comes up a lot. In fact, if you even look in the Masorah Shas to see where this comes up, it says in Kiddushin Kafav, Bisham Nisman. That means this is too long for me to write all the places where it appears, and go look there and you'll see where else. Nechasim she'en lahem achrayut. Now we have to get this terminology. Nechasim that don't have achrayut. What does that mean? That means property that can't be liened. That means movables. Okay, or not property, possessions. Money, anything that's yours. Ein lahem achrayut means they have no responsibility. That means if I took out a loan from you, you can go collect it from stuff I sold to somebody else, but only if it's nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut, meaning if I sold land to someone after I took out the loan, that property is liened to you. So you can go collect the loan if I don't pay you back from whoever I sold the land to. They can then come back to me, and that's why it's called nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut, and say, hey, what happened? I sold you land, you sold me land, and now you took it away. Compensate me for it. That's what it means. It has achrayut, it has responsibility. When I sell it, I have a responsibility that if someone takes it away from you, I will return them the money. But you still can go collect it from them, and then they have to come collecting from me. If it's ein lahem achrayut, that's all movable property. You can't go take, if I sold my telephone to someone, you can't go collect my phone from somebody else. There's no responsibility attached to that. So basically what they say is the following. There's a rule that nechasim she'en lahem achrayut, which sounds complicated, but all it means really is land, okay? Land is niknim im nechasim I'm sorry, I just said that wrong. Ein lahem is movables. Nechasim that don't have responsibility, like movables, niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut, can be purchased together with things that have achrayut, meaning with land. That means, okay, this sounds right, like the language is complicated, even I got tripped up on it, but what it's saying is that if I'm selling you land and movables, we can do a kinyan on the land, like chazaka, you could start working the land, and in that same deal, if I sold you movables, they're already yours, okay? That's how it works. It makes a lot of sense. Since a more strong type of chazaka is needed for the land, if we do them both all in one, like the plant in the pot, so if you acquire the plant in a way that you worked it, which is relevant to land, then basically you've acquired the pot as well. But if you did a chazaka on the pot, like let's say you got a pot and you decided to paint it much nicer and it looks much better. Well, you're not going to acquire that at all. And the only way you're going to get this whole thing right is if you do a chazaka on the plant. Doing a chazaka on the movable item isn't going to help you at all. Nikavo ba'aretz. Okay, that was case number 2, where we talked about laws of kinyanim. Now we move on to the next issue. Nikvo ba'aretz v'nafo b'chutz ha'aretz. Classic example. We have a plant on the border. Okay, it's sitting right on the border of Israel and outside of Israel, right where the laws of mitzvot hatzliyot ba'aretz, things that are only done in the land of Israel, like Shemitah and Trumot and Masrot and all that, all the times. And so it's whole, the perforations are in Israel, but the nof, what's growing from the plant, goes out into outside of Israel. So let's say there's fruits growing from this big plant, some sort of fruit, or are you allowed to eat them without taking Trumot or Masrot if they're growing, let's say, on the side of Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel. Abai Amar batar nikvo azlinan. Rav Amar batar nofo azlinan. Again, machloket Abai and Rava. Abai says we follow the perforation, which makes the most sense because, that's what we say. That's where it gets its nutrients from the ground. Abai actually makes the most sense. We're going to have to figure out Rava. And especially, again, we always hold like Rava, so Rava seems kind of strange here. Rava says we follow the nof, where it's growing. Now, by the way, this has to do with also, we know plants grow from photosynthesis, right, from the sun. And the sun is getting to the area that's outside the ground, right? So there's 2 parts of the plant that are helping it grow. One is the roots and one is the air and, the sun and all that. So now they say, okay, wait a minute. We didn't understand this machloka properly. If it really took root, if the roots, let's say they came out of the holes in the pot and they went into the ground, of course, and the ground is, let's say, in Israel, of course, it's going to be based on Israel. And if the holes are on the side of Chutz La'aretz, of course, it's going to be Chutz La'aretz. So that's for sure, because the roots clearly are where it gets more of its nutrients. The machloket ki pligi b'delo ishush. The machloket is if it didn't come out, the roots didn't come out through the holes, and then there's a machloket. Okay, that's the assumption. To which the Gemara is going to question this from 2 sources. Is it really true that b'di ishrish they all agree that if it took root, everyone agrees it goes by the roots? And we're going to show 2 cases that don't seem to follow the roots. And then we're going to answer both questions. We'll answer one by one. Okay, we'll have the first question, we'll answer it. Second question, yes. Ubidi ishrush lo pligi. Really? They don't argue in a case of bidi ishrush? Now, we're not going to bring Abai and Rava specifically, but we're going to say, is there no machloket? And v'hatnan, don't we have a Mishna that says, and this is a Mishna Bava Metzia, shtei ginot zo al gav zo v'yarak b'intayim. This is a very interesting case. I find it interesting. You'll see why it's interesting more when we get to the arguments of each side. We have one garden high and one garden low. Now, when you have a high garden and a low garden, there's going to be a part that goes down, right? And we talked about this the other day about creating a wall. Can you say that that's a mechitza, right? Because it's not actually a wall, but it kind of functions as a wall, because if one, imagine it's at right angles. So here's a garden goes down, and there's a garden. Now, exactly where it goes down and you have this sort of wall, there's something growing out of there, okay? There's a tree, a plant, something growing out. So the roots are obviously in the upper garden, but it's growing out, obviously, into the airspace of the bottom garden because that's the only way it can be. So you can't imagine this is a good picture in the Koran, by the way. So now, Rabbi Meir Omer Shel Elyon. Rabbi Meir says, who owns this? The upper one, because the roots are in his land. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shel Tachton, because it belongs to the bottom one, because the airspace, it's in the airspace of the bottom one. So now you see, even if something took root, there's still a machloket here. So theoretically, why did you assume that Abaye and Rava don't argue? Maybe they argue about the exact same thing that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda argue about. To which the Gemara is going to say, no. That's totally different. Hatam kidikatani tana. There, it even says the reason. So it's clear that this has nothing to do with it took root or do we not follow the roots. This is a totally separate issue. And it's a unique case because of the exact positioning. And this is why it's really important to visualize this case, because if you visualize it, you'll understand it. So now I'm a Rabbi Meir. Here we have it explicitly stated there. Rabbi Meir says, Ma'im yirtzeh elyon litolet afaro, ein kan yarak. The upper one, it belongs to the upper one because if he wanted to, he could get rid of it entirely. He could dig up his land and there would be no tree there or whatever growth there would be. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, ma'im yirtzeh atachton lemalot ginato afal. If the lower one filled in his, right, remember, they're on two different levels. If he raised his garden, he brought tons of extra soil, put all the soil up and covered up the tree or the growth, there would be nothing there. Okay, this sounds to me like the machloket. If you remember, there's a very famous machloket, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. What do you do first in Kiddush Friday night? Do you say Borei Pri Agafin, which is what we do, or do you say Mikadesh HaShabbat? What's the machloket there? So one says, what causes Kiddush? Wine. If you didn't have wine, there would be no Kiddush. And the other one says, if you didn't have Shabbos, there would be no wine. So it's a matter of what causes what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So here it's the same kind of idea. Who could destroy this, right? In other words, if it weren't for the dirt of the upper person, you wouldn't have it. And if he got rid of his dirt, you wouldn't have it. If it weren't for the airspace of the bottom one, there would be no growth here because it would be covered up. So either one has an argument, and that's why Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree about this, about who is kind of the more important one. Just like, right, it's in the end, we have to paskin, but the logic of both is true, just like the logic of the Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel machloket is also true. Obviously, we have to pick one, and we chose Beit Hillel, wine comes first, but it's a good debate. So that is a totally separate issue. That has nothing to do with our case where we have something on the border and did it take root or did it not? And basically, we could still say that if it took root, everybody follows the roots. And this is just a unique case because there's a bottom person whose airspace is critical to the growth of this tree because he could basically block its growth. And that's why there's a machlok. Second question on this. Do they really not argue if it's Jewish? Again, we're going to show it seems like they do argue. The Hatanya, here's a bright. Ilan is going to be a similar case. Mikzato ba'aretz umikzato b'chutz la'aretz. Now you have a tree that's part in Israel, part outside of Israel. Now, if I tell you there's a tree that's part in, part out, probably you're going to imagine the same way you have with your neighbors, where the tree's growing on one side, right? And the branches are, some go into your garden and some are in their friend's garden. So in the beginning, they're going to assume that we're talking about a split in the branches, okay? So now, but yet the roots are probably on one side or the other. So ilan miksato ba'aretz miksato b'chutz la'aretz. So part of it is in Israel, part of it is outside of Israel. Tevel v'chulim u'ravim sebazeh divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says everything growing from this tree has a mix of tevel and non-tevel stuff. What does tevel mean? Tevel means stuff that you didn't take trumot u'maschal, meaning they're obligated in trumot u'maschal. Okay, that's the simple. So it has things that are obligated in trumot u'maschal, and it also has things that are not obligated in trumot u'maschal, which is chulin. Basically meaning every fruit on this tree is half obligated in trumot u'maschal and half not. Okay, this tree is viewed as a total mix. Rashba Gomel, No, what's growing on, and this is why I imagine, or really the Gemara imagines it, at least at the first reading, which is going to create our difficulty, that it must mean half is growing into your field, on the side of outside of Israel, and half is growing on my field on the side of inside of Israel, and whatever grows on that side is outside of Israel, and whatever grows on this side is inside Israel, and therefore those don't need all the laws of Truma Masra, and this needs the laws of Truma Masra, which seems like either which way you go by, it doesn't matter where the roots are, because it doesn't talk about the roots. Okay, it doesn't mention, right here it sounds like the roots could be all on one side, and it doesn't make a difference. We're going to follow where it's growing. So that's how they understand this source. My love is this nut. Now, it didn't really talk about the words nof or shoresh. Didn't talk about what's growing and what's in the ground. But they assume, and that's why I explained it, the way you would normally assume this seems to be saying, which is miksat nofo ba'aretz, miksat nofo b'chutz ba'aretz. As I said, it must be some of it's growing there, some of it's growing here. And what do you see, right? And then it all goes by where it's growing, and it doesn't, right? There's with the ishrush, it's not, right? With the ishrush, it doesn't go, it's not so clear, like we said before, that it all goes with the ishrush. No, there's a machloket. Do we follow here? It's really, following the no or not. It's unclear, but they seems to be, doesn't matter where it took root, which goes totally against what we said. To which they respond by saying, why did you assume that's what it was meant? No, miksat shoroshim ba'aretz and miksat shoroshim b'chutz la'aretz. The split between them is under the ground. And that's why. And that resolves our issue, because then we're going to say, right, now we're going to have to figure out what the machloket is, but we'll get there in a second. So what's the complicated part? If some of the roots are here and some of the roots are there, then the Rebbe makes perfect sense. What does he say? Since it's got roots on this side and roots on that side, everything is a mix, because we assume the roots all, right, they might be separated at the bottom, but when everything grows, it grows from parts of both sides. And therefore, it's not like there's a border in between the two. And therefore, I kind of laugh, but wait, we're going to get there. And therefore, all the fruits that grow are a combination. And that's why Rebbe says what he says. So the problem with this interpretation is Rashbag. So the Gemara says, "Umay tama de Rashbag." How does Rashbag explain what grows there grows there? How can I possibly separate between what grows from those roots and what grows from those roots? That's why the first explanation made a lot more sense, that it was what we see physically, the fruits on that side versus the fruits on that side. So they answered the mafsik sunma. The case must be that in the middle of the tree under the ground, there's a stone that separates between those roots and those roots. And therefore, we're going to assume what Rashbag thinks is that whatever is coming from that side is growing from the roots on that side. And whatever's coming from that side is growing the roots on the other side. So now they're going to have to figure out my time to Rebbe. So if the roots are totally split, then why does Rebbe think they're not, that everything is mixed up? So here it's more an agronomical question. So they now answer, my time to Rebbe, the Hadre Arve. Well, even if the roots are separated down below and there's a stone in between them that splits in between, when they get up higher, they combine again. Okay, and what's the root of the machloket? Mar savar avira mevalbel. The Rebbe says that the air, meaning where the tree gets above ground, that mixes all the nutrients up again together. Even if they're split down below, they're going to be combined up atop. Like this definitely requires a science experiment. I see Gittin wrote something about science experiment. I didn't read the whole thing, but yes, this would be a good science experiment to do. I mean, how you'd have to really figure it out and then cut the tree in half and see do the roots really stick to their own side. And Rabbi Shpag thinks they really keep separate. What have we proven here? That actually it does follow the roots, or at least you could explain this source as following the roots, and it doesn't contradict our previous assumption that if it really took root and they came out of the perforated pot, then it would clearly follow the roots. And our question was, when it didn't, how do you deal with it? Okay. Now, that was what we did. Again, we started with a case where somebody gives a woman a perforated pot, either the pot or the plant itself. Does that work? Is this considered something attached to the ground or not? Clearly the pot, no, not a problem, but question about the leaf, or maybe we don't worry about it. From there, we got into kinyanim with these two different parts. and how that works interchangeably. From there, we got to a perforated pot that's on the border. And what do we do? How do we treat it in terms of Hilchot of Eretz Yisrael? Do the laws apply or do they not? And the machloket seems to be only if they didn't take root. If they took root, obviously, yes. So then, right, we got into this whole question, 2 questions against this. These 2 Tanaitic sources seem to indicate even with the Ishur there's a machloket, and each one we resolved in its own way. Now we're moving on to the next part of today's sugya. The end of the Mishnah yesterday, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera said, "Ein kotvin lo ala niyar machuk v'lo ala diftera." You can't write on things that can on parchment that can be erased, okay, or paper that you can erase on without noticing there was anything being erased. So if it doesn't make any sort of mark when you erase it, then it's a problem because we're worried that maybe it had a condition in the get. This will be your get if you give me all this money, which sometimes can happen, or if you do the following or don't do the following or whatever it might be. Again, we learned it has to be limited in time. Otherwise, it's not a sefer hakoret beino lebeino, right? Beino lebeina, it can't be an indefinite time, but there could be a condition, which means that if the condition is not fulfilled, the get's not a get. Now, if she brings this get to the court and says, look, I'm divorced, and she erased the condition, the stipulation, well, then we won't know that it's actually not, we'll think it's a get and it's really not. That's the concern of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. But the rabbis are machshirim. They're not concerned about this. So we're going to have to figure out why not. But first, before we get to that, we're going to get up on a bit of a tangent about parchments and leather that was, and the parchment is just leather from an animal, right? The skin of the animal that's been processed. So we're going to talk about different ways of processing leather. Or tanning leather. So here we're going to go. There's 3 types of leather and different processes they go through. Matzah, interesting, it's called matzah. We'll see why in a minute. Chipa v'diftera. Okay, this is why we're getting to this because diftera is our topic. Matzah kemashmo. Sounds like matzah. What does that mean? Right? Matzah is the most simple type of bread. So, lo maliach, lo kamiach, v'delo apins. It's not salted. It's not, they would put like a flour, I don't know if they put actual flour, some sort of floury substance on it, and it's not with the gallnut. Talked about processing with the gallnuts. So it has neither of those processes done to it. Lamai hilchata, what's the relevance? Okay, they're telling us, right, we're not here to have a lesson in how they tan leather. This isn't a leather tanning class. So why are you telling us this? Well, Lehotza'at Shabbat. Talk about Masechet Shabbat. Now we really get back to things we learned in Masechet Shabbat, which is, if you remember, when we learned about carrying on Shabbat, what happens? If I have crumbs that I'm carrying out that are totally, right, what are crumbs used for? Nothing. I don't get punished for that. Okay, that's not considered carrying. It's only considered carrying when I carry something of significance. Now, different items have significance. Food, for example, it would have to be a kezayit, an olive bulb. Otherwise, it's not important enough to say, oh, I carried something. You carried, even like one cracker wouldn't really count. Okay, but when it comes to leather, so the question is, what is each leather used for? What's its significance? Which would then mean if I carried that amount, I'd be liable on Shabbat. We have to find the least, right, the smallest amount of something, of this item that would be usable. So this basically is going to teach us what they use the matzah leather for. So, kama shiuro, what's the amount? To take a small weight, they would wrap them with this leather around it. Bekama, how big is this small weight? This doesn't help us, but it obviously helped them. Amora ki riva de pupadita. It's a quarter of a litra, which was the coin they used in pupadita. That's the size that we're talking about. That would cover that coin. Thank you. The Koran says 28 grams. Okay. Next. Hipa dimaliach velo kamiach velo apitz. This is like bingo. Every time you're going to drop one or add one. So now we're going to have it's salted, but it's not kamiach. You didn't use the flour and they didn't use the gallnut. Lamai hilchata lehotzat Shabbat. Again, what's the relevance for Shabbat? How so? Kama shiuro hiditnan or kedei lasot kameh, to make an amulet. Now, some people say it's to make an amulet. The amulets were made out of leather. Some people say it's to cover an amulet. Okay, different ways of understanding it. Again, maybe it depended on who was living where and what kind of amulets they used, or maybe in some places they weren't using amulets, so they just kind of thought this must be what it means. But again, it doesn't really help us because we don't really have these things and we don't really know what these sides are. Diftera, dimalia, vikamiach, udelo apitz. Diftera is, again, we're going to go up one. It has the maliach, it has the kamiach, it just doesn't have the apatzim, the walnuts. Lemay hilchata, lehotzat Shabbat. No, it's not that it doesn't have it, right? It wasn't processed with them. So what's the relevance? Kama shiuro, how much? Kedei lechtov alav to get. Here you see, because the rabbi said you could write on diftera, so the most, right, the smallest use of diftera would be for writing a get. And some people say we're tying that as just like the first line or the important line of the get, which has his name, her name, and all that stuff. That kind of, not even for a whole get, but even the small part of it. So I don't know why they would say that, because what's the use of the get without the rest of it? But anyway, that's what they say. Now we're going to really get to this opinion of in the Mishnah. Before we move on, we have to clarify one thing or two things. We have a Bachaloket. We'll just review, even though we talked about this already today. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Elazar. Again, Rabbi Meir says Eidei Fatima. Rabbi Elazar says Eidei Mesir. The ones who give the get, the witnesses who witness the giving of the get, not the witnesses who witness, right, who are signed on the get. Rabbi Meir says it's the one signed on the get. That's Rabbi Elazar, who's arguing with Rabbi Meir, who's a tana. Now we're going to have two machlokot between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. Now don't confuse, it's going to sound very confusing. But Rabbi Elazar, who's going to be talking, is Rabbi Elazar and Amora, who's a student of Rabbi Yochanan, living in the second generation of Amoraim in Israel. Not the same tana. He's going to be talking about the tana, Rabbi Elazar, which is going to be confusing. Okay? The amora is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, and the tana is Rabbi Elazar ben Shamoah. It would have been helpful had they added that, but they didn't. So we're going to, as long as you know that, you'll be fine. Chachamim machshirim. So now they want to know man chachamim. What opinion are the chachamim following? Again, every time we get to this Mishnayot, we're going to have to figure out, is this Rabbi Elazar or is it Rabbi Meir? What is it going by? To which they say, and this everyone's going to agree with, even though we're going to have two machlokot of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan, they actually both agree that Amar Rabbi Elazar says this, and Rabbi Yochanan won't disagree with the first part, Rabbi Elazar. Okay, this is Rabbi Elazar, Damar Edim Mesira Karte. It's obviously Rabbi Elazar, because if it's Rabbi Meir who says the signatures are important, well, then it's the document that's important. So you can't have a document that can be forged. And especially if they'll only go look, when the husband comes to complain, they'll go figure out the signatures, they'll verify the document, they'll say, oh, the document looks good. Now, if someone erased a condition in the get, maybe it's not actually a get, and we'll have a big problem. So if you're not going to be searching for the Eidei Mesira who saw the get being given, then yeah, this is going to be a problem. But if you have Eidei Mesira, the assumption is, and we're going to talk about this in one more minute, though, a little bit further, the assumption is, right, we're now at the top of Amud Bet, if you're Rabbi Elazar and you say the Eidei Mesira, well, the Eidei Mesira, we already learned, they read through the get before they give it. So they read the get, they'll see there's a condition. So when they go to the court will say, did you see the husband give a get? Was there a condition? And he'll know, the Eidim will know because they'll have read the document. But he adds one other thing. Okay, so he says, Rabbi Elazar, he damar Eidim Mesira. Okay, that works. And like I said, Rabbi Yochanan's going to agree with that. Nobody's going to think this matches Rabbi Meir. Like the first part of the Mishnah where we were able to explain it, both like Rabbi Meir and like Rabbi Elazar, this has to follow only Rabbi Elazar. Ve'amar Rabbi Elazar. Now further, Rabbi Elazar the amora says, the later one, Lo hichshir Rabbi Elazar, this is where the lines get tricky. Rabbi Elazar the tana only allowed it though in what case? And here we get into, and this comes up all over Gittin and all over, this is what I love about this Masechet and all the upcoming Masechet that we're going to have for a long time, is all this legal stuff between, human relationships. We always have to start thinking about what do we assume, how do we assume human behavior is going to be, right? There's patterns of the way humans behave. And how do we incorporate that into halacha? So he says, Lo ichshir Rabbi Elazar ela la'alter. Rabbi Elazar only permits this if it's immediate. What does that mean, immediate? So Rashi explains, ela la'alter, sheheviato, it's a few lines below in Rashi, heviato lebeitim b'yom shenimsar la. The Eidei Mesira go on that same day to the court, lahodia, shehi grusha v'yitiru alinaseh. This, by the way, happens nowadays. When you get a get, what happens? They actually destroy the get. They destroy the get because Why? They don't want the husband to come later and say the get's disqualified. So they could say the get's disqualified, but it's disqualified because we disqualified it. And then there's no way for the husband to claim later, oh, the get's disqualified. But if the woman doesn't get her get and the get, right, she doesn't get it. It either stays in their records, or sometimes they don't even keep it. But the point is, what happens? So what does she get? She gets what's called a Maaseh Beitin, which is a document that the Beitin says the get was a good get, right? This woman has a get, okay? She doesn't keep the get itself because that would just open up a Pandora's box for later, the husband to claim property. She has a thing that the Beitin said, we verified this get. So now, right, which is actually stronger in a sense. So now it seems that even then they used to do it. And it's called a Maaseh get, but what it's called is she gets a 2 Gerushim. Okay, but the Maaseh Beitin is the action where the Beitin basically verifies the get and says this is the get, and then you're right, they issue her what's called a 2 Gerushim. So now, what happens? If they come to court right away on that day and say, we saw this man divorce this woman, they testify in front of the court, and then it's totally fine. Because why? Because we assume if it's on the same day, if there was a condition and they read that there was a condition in the get, they remember that day. But what do we assume people are going to remember? What do we assume they're not going to remember? Or how long do we assume they're going to remember it for? Rabbi Elazar, the amora, says, people don't remember things, right? We forget, right? What did you eat for dinner last night? Who can remember, right? On Sunday, I speak to my parents and say, how was Shabbat? Who remembers Shabbat already? I'm on Sunday. So we don't remember all these things. So when these Eidim Mesira, what are they really going to remember? They're going to remember the important part. He divorced her, right? So they'll come and testify he divorced her. They won't remember there was a condition. It won't be written there, right? They probably also might think, oh, it's written there. I don't really need to put that in my memory. I don't need to waste my memory space on this. So it had a condition that could have been erased. She could erase it to prove that she was divorced when she really wasn't, because maybe the condition wasn't fulfilled. And therefore, it's a concern. We're worried maybe it had a stipulation and now it's forward, they erased it, and it's going to be a problem. Mean, by the way, means forever even. It doesn't mean exactly 10 days. It's a catch-all phrase for anything that's not immediate. Okay? So basically, Rabbi Elazar says this is only going to work if the Eidim come to court immediately and testify. So number one, it's only according to Rabbi Elazar, Eidim Mesira. And it's only going to work, this diftera, right, or something that could be erased without any noticing, only if they come to the court that day. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees and says, what are you talking about? Of course they're going to remember. Dalet and Zion switch. So midkar dekiri means mizkar zachire. They're going to remember. Of course people are going to remember that. What's your job as a witness if not to remember the basic parts of the get? The get, it was given, and there was a stipulation. That's a major part of the get. Of course they're going to remember. Even, it seems like even 2 years later. That's their job. So basically, he thinks people will remember that kind of thing. And therefore, you don't even have to worry down the road. So there's a big machloket here between the two of them. Rabbi Elazar is obviously much more strict, and Rabbi Yochanan is more lenient. Same thing is going to be with the next. They're going to have another machloket. Amar Rabbi Elazar, again the amora. Lo ichshir Rabbi Elazar ela b'Gittin. This Mishna that says you can use paper that can be erased is only by get. Okay, again, he's limiting. Only if the Eidim Mesira come that day, and only by get. Aval b'shar shtarot lo. But in other documents, it doesn't work. Why? Because other documents are learned out from this pasuk. In Yirmiyahu, there's a pasuk where he's supposed to buy, there's pasukim that talk about he's supposed to buy land from his uncle in Israel to show that we're going to come back and redeem the land, and we're going to come back after the destruction. Unitatem b'kli cheres, l'man yamdu yamim rabim, and put it in a vessel. It sounds like, like an SOS message around the world, right? Put it, save it, so that it will stand for many, many days. Now, if it's a document that can be erased, it's not a document that can stand for many days, so it doesn't count for any other shtar. And by the way, this is also seems to be, thank you, a buried time capsule. That's what I was thinking of. It also seems to be that we're talking about that they're probably by get, we're lenient again because of the aguna issue. But by other shtarot, we're not going to allow this. Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu b'shtarot. What is he going to do with v'haktiv l'man yamdu yamim rabim? Someone just said, do we learn from Nevi'im? Right? Depends when. But this was just good advice. Do it this way. It doesn't mean you're going to learn halacha from. Okay, so there we had two machlokot to summarize this section. After we finished with the atzis naku, we went to number one, talking about three different types of tanning of leather. Then we had this big machloket within the rabbis, which we said the rabbis is Rabbi Elazar, and then we have two machlokot, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua, about it. Last part for today, hakol ksherin lichtov et get, new Mishna. Everyone can write a get. Afilu cheresh shotet katan, even a deaf mute, or a shotet, someone without sound mind, and a katana minor. Haisha kotevet et gita, she can write her own get. We learned this already. Haish kotevet shavaro, he can write his own receipt that he paid her, even though theoretically it's supposed to be the reverse. Remember, hamakneh, the one who's supposed to give the shtar to someone else is supposed to be the one who owns it. And here the husband's supposed to give the wife the get, so he should have written it. And the woman is supposed to give the receipt, I got my money, but it could be the reverse. Okay. Remember, we even said it had to be the reverse, but here it seems like it could be. She could write her get, not that she has to. She ain't kiyuma get because it's really the signatures that are important. Well, and with one very last line, because I don't want you to go away thinking, what do you mean? Can write a get? How could that possibly be? They're not considered people with knowledge. So, hala b'nei de'aninu, but wait, they don't have knowledge. How could they possibly write a get? Amar Rav Huna v'hu shaya gadol omer al gabav. It's only if there was adult supervising. There was an adult supervising, then we allow them to write it. Okay, we'll get to this more tomorrow, but I did want to end without clarifying that minor point. Okay, we'll end here for today. Have a great day, everyone.